unit, and the name of our new unit is World War II and Foreign Policy. So I'm just going to write that up here, and you can do that in your notebook. Okay, so we have 2 units left for the year, so this is going to be a very long unit. And so what we're going to do is we'll talk about what happened in World War II, starting today, and then we're going to take American foreign policy through the Cold War all the way up to the present. So our question for today is, why did the United States get involved in World War II? So in between the world wars, we know that there was a worldwide depression. And in the 1930s, things were really bad in terms of the economy all around the world. And so different leaders came to power promising change, promising that they could fix things. Like we saw in the United States, FDR came, he promised Americans a New Deal, he promised that he would try to change the system, and he put certain programs in place to try to relieve people's suffering and to try to make sure that the economy wouldn't crash like that again. So he put a more regulated system of capitalism in place. In other nations, we see fascist leaders coming to power. And these fascist leaders were like totalitarian dictators. And so whatever they said went, and they had very strict control over their countries and the economies of their countries. And so we see Hitler coming to power in Germany, Mussolini coming to power in Italy. And in Germany, we see the rise of National Socialism, which is another way of saying Nazism. And so that was an intense feeling of nationalism, racism, and the worship of violence. And Hitler started to take some actions that were in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. He started to build up the military of Germany, and that was not really allowed, but it was problematic for the rulers of Europe because they didn't really know how to handle it. They were psychologically scarred from World War I. They didn't really feel they were in a strong enough position to stop him. So there was a meeting in 1938 called the Munich Conference. And at this meeting, we see leaders from France, Britain, and Germany coming together, and Hitler promised that he just wanted a certain piece of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland, and that's this dark area in purple here. And if those other leaders would give him this area, then he would make no further demands. And so they agreed to give him that one area of Czechoslovakia. And when the meeting ended, Chamberlain returns and he said, "We had achieved peace for our time," which is one of the most famous wrong statements in history. And so in class, what I would have you do is I would have you draw a thought bubble above Hitler's head right here. Say, what do you think he was thinking while he was signing on the dotted line, promising that he would not take Czechoslovakia? Because we know that 6 months later, he went on to take the rest of Czechoslovakia. And what the leaders of the other world powers had done at this meeting is called appeasement. And that means to agree to the demands of an enemy in order to keep the peace. Okay, and so they practiced this policy, and it was a real failure. And so how did this policy fail? Hitler did not keep his promise. He attacked Czechoslovakia within 6 months of his promise not to do so. And this conference changed world relations because it showed that Hitler that he would not keep his promises. It put the other world powers in a bad position. They either act against Germany for his lack of keeping to his word, or send a message that they are weak. Unfortunately, France and Britain and the other powers were not ready to take on Germany, and they did send the message that Germany could be aggressive, and nobody would stop them. So this meeting is really famous. It's a famous historical event, which you should absolutely know. When people talk about the Munich Conference, they think appeasement, and that's one of the disasters that led to World War II. Okay. So, what was going on in Europe and Asia? Well, we see aggressive actions taken by Japan attacking Manchuria and China, Hitler pulling out of the League of Nations, ending his reparation payments, beginning to rearm, secretly planning to take over neighboring countries. Italy attacked Ethiopia in Africa. Hitler ordered his troops into the Rhineland, an area that the Treaty of Versailles had declared demilitarized. So while all of this was going on, we see the League of Nations taking very little action. They started to organize some economic boycotts. They formally reprimanded these leaders for their actions, but there was not much they could do because the League of Nations had no standing army and had no peacekeeping force. Then a new alliance was formed between Italy, Germany, and Japan called the Axis powers. Also in 1936, we see the Spanish Civil War taking place between the Loyalist Republicans fighting with the fascist-backed rebels under Francisco Franco. Hitler and Mussolini sent in aid to Franco, and Russia backed the Loyalists. America also did send in some troops. Britain and France did as well, but not officially. Eventually, Franco won, and that was just another nation becoming fascist on the European continent. And when Hitler attacked Poland in September of 1939, that's the beginning of World War II. Okay, so the causes of World War II can be summed up by the failure of the League of Nations, that the League of Nations didn't have enough power to prevent the aggressive nations of Germany, Italy, and Japan from taking over land belonging to other countries. This Munich conference that we talked about earlier, Germany learned the lesson that it could act in aggressive ways, take over other areas, break the terms of the Treaty of Versailles without consequence. And then when Germany attacked Poland, that was the beginning of the war. So what was the United States doing during this time? Well, the United States was trying to stay neutral. They didn't want to get involved the way they got involved in World War I. Okay, so they passed a series of neutrality acts. The first one said we're not going to sell any weapons to any nations involved in war, that should say, and prohibited travel of American citizens on all hostile vessels. So this was designed to prevent U.S. arms manufacturers, bankers, and merchants from profiting from a foreign war. If you recall the causes of American involvement in World War I, we loaned $2.3 billion to the Allies for that war. We wanted to make sure we got it back. Well, now this law says we're not going to allow that to happen again. The Neutrality Act of 1936 extended this law and said we're not going to loan money to any nation involved in a war. 1937, they banned the shipment of war supplies to either side in the Spanish Civil War. And Roosevelt disagreed with this law, and he claimed that it was necessary to quarantine the aggressor nations. So this is known as his quarantine speech, which is funny that it should be the same word, the word that we're dealing with now. But anyway, Roosevelt was beginning to see that that what was happening in Europe was going to be a problem for the United States. Congress and the rest of the country really did not want to get involved. They were very much interested in staying isolated, staying out of World War II. But because Roosevelt was president of the United States, he had a different perspective, and he started to see that this might not be something we'd be able to avoid. So sometimes these neutrality laws are called storm cellar diplomacy, meaning that the United States is kind of trying to stay safe in this storm cellar while the world is going to war. So there's a big storm going on worldwide. So if you think about the scene from A Wizard of Oz when Dorothy and her family run into the storm cellar and they're trying to stay safe from the big storm. Okay, and then this cartoonist is kind of making a mockery of that plan, because if the United States stays in this little outhouse here and the storm of World War II comes along, they're not likely to be safe. Okay, we have another Neutrality Act in 1939 that did allow arms sales, but Britain, France, and later Russia had to come to the United States for the weapons, and they had to pay cash. So this is known as the cash and carry policy. And this makes sense if you think about this in terms of why we got involved in World War I. We loaned money to our friends in Europe. We had Americans get killed on the Lusitania and the Sussex and the Arabic, the ships that went into Europe. So in order to prevent those types of things from happening, we're not going to loan any money. We're not going to send Americans into the war zone. So that's what this cash and carry policy was. But then things started to get really, really bad. France fell to the Axis powers pretty shortly in 1940. And I know this map is a little bit further into the future than where we are in our notes. This is in 1942, but if you look at this red area, this is all area controlled by the Axis powers. So this is pretty disastrous for the continent of Europe. And so who's really left to fight? Britain. Okay, so FDR is seeing that this is going to be a problem, and he gives this famous speech called the Four Freedoms Message, saying that, it's up to the United States to protect freedom around the world, freedom of expression, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. That's a very famous speech there. And in June of 1941, before the United States gets involved still, we see disaster hitting Great Britain. Hitler's launching massive airstrikes, 18,000 tons of explosives dropped on England in 8 months, over 18,000 men, 16,000 women, 5,000 children are killed, and they're just bombing cities and civilians. Okay, so it's really getting very, very bad. It was already very, very bad, so I should say it's getting worse. Okay, the Lend-Lease law is another law passed, and this kind of changed things for the United States because this said that the United States is going to lend money and lease equipment to our friends who had run out of money and run out of weapons. So we're willing to take a little bit of a risk now because things are so bad. Our president, FDR, met the British Prime Minister, William Churchill, and they met aboard a ship in the Atlantic, and they signed the Atlantic Charter, which set out the war goals for the Allies. And FDR also initiated the first peacetime military draft. So he knows that this is coming, even though the United States public and Congress might not have been behind him at this point. Okay, so this question, how did these events indicate the United States stepping closer and closer to involvement in the war? I numbered them out here. So we've talked about these neutrality acts, the cash and carry policy, the Four Freedoms speech, Lend-Lease, Atlantic Charter, and the peacetime draft. So 7, 8, and 9 are developments down here. We see that the United States put a fuel embargo on Japan, so they would be short on fuel and they couldn't fly into China and launch other attacks. Then Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and on December 7th, 1941, and the day after that, Congress declared war on Japan. And then Germany declared war on the United States. And then the United States was officially involved in World War II. Have a great day, everybody.